While many biblical examples of motherhood that we have in the Bible are of women of righteous and loving and humble character, some examples that we have are of people we don't want to emulate. Today, we're going to talk about one horrendous mother in the Bible, and I'll uncover what this woman's biggest flaw was and how to avoid it in our own journeys with motherhood. That's today on the Mama Disciple podcast. Thanks for tuning in to the Mama Disciple podcast. I'm your host, Rihanna Sanford. I'm a homeschooling and special needs mom. I'm a health advocate. And most importantly, I'm a fellow disciple of Christ. My heart is to help mamas like you better steward their health, their roles as mamas, and most importantly, their walk with Jesus. So let's dive right in. Today, we're going to see how sometimes looking at bad examples in the Bible can help us to learn what not to do, how not to live. We're talking about Herodias. Now, Herodias is known, if you've never heard that name before, she is known as the woman who had a lot to do with having John the Baptist beheaded. The worst thing to me in this story is that of all people, the way that she got what she wanted was by using her daughter. Now, before I get into all the points that I want to cover today, let's read this passage of scripture where this account is told about Herodias. We're going to be in Mark chapter 6, verses 18 through 28. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Issue number one. And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet heard him gladly. Verse 21 goes on to say, but an opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests, and the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he vowed to her, "Whatever you ask of me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom." And that's a huge offer, right? That's what he offered Herodias' daughter for dancing. Now that must have been some kind of dancing she was doing. Okay. I'll come back to that later. And she went out and said to her mother, so she's going to her mom now and asking for advice. Essentially, she says, "For what should I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist on a platter." It would be one thing just to say the head of John the Baptist, but there's some grandstanding here saying on a platter, right? Okay, moving on. Verse 26 says, and the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison and brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. Okay, so obviously, right off the bat, there's a lot of issues that we can see in this passage. I don't know if you've ever read this before and really just looked at it and just studied it for what it is, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background, okay? So at the very beginning, I mentioned that John had a problem and had criticized Herod for being with his brother's wife. So obviously there's adultery here, and John is pointing that out. Why is he pointing it out? Well, according to Jewish law, that was unlawful. What we find out is it's not only just unlawful for Herod to be with his brother Philip's wife, it's also morally and politically seen as not a good look, right? It kind of gave them a bad rep, not just with John, a holy and righteous man, but also in the eyes of society. John the Baptist had openly been criticizing this marriage, and Herodias didn't like that. Herodias had an issue. Okay, so this is pride, right? Herodias had an issue with John having the nerve to criticize their marriage, their adulterous affair. It's for this reason that she has cultivated this obsessive and vile desire in her heart to see John the Baptist dead. Why? Now, what is the root of that? Well, we can see pride, right? There's obviously some pride there. How dare you tell me I can't have what I want? But also, there's this selfish ambition. This was a woman who had what she wanted in mind. First of all, she wanted somebody else's, somebody else who wasn't her husband, okay, trying to basically marry Herod while she was still with Philip. So she has this issue with selfish ambition. And I think that this is the seed that's going to ruin things and actually make things really, really difficult for her daughter as well as her marriage with Herod. We'll see that later. And can I just mention for a moment that one other issue, I mentioned this in the text, right? She was okay with her daughter, with, first of all, Herod, her husband, parading her daughter. Salome is her name. Salome. My husband says salami, and I said, I don't think that that's how it's said, but nonetheless, I digress. So her daughter, Salome, she actually was the one that was dancing in front of these men, right? And her mother was okay with Herod parading her daughter around in front of all these men. That, to me, that does not spell a protective mother. That does not spell a mother of nobleness, of holiness, of righteousness. If she's okay with her daughter dancing, which was probably a rather seductive and suggestive dance in front of all of these men. That kind of just breaks my heart when I read that. So that's an issue with this mom. She was not one who was protecting her daughter or raising her daughter in the way for her to be respectful of herself, right? So then let's go on to this other point of here her daughter comes to her and asks her for her advice. And what does she say? Instead of kind of considering how would this, what would she, what would her daughter want? What might be good for her daughter? Here her daughter is being offered this huge thing, right? From Herod. And instead of thinking about what her daughter might want, she tells her what she wants. So this is not a woman of selflessness. This is not a woman of humility. This is a woman of selfish ambition. She wanted what she wanted, and she was going to use her daughter to get what she wanted. So again, we're looking at this horrendous example of a mom for the particular reason so that we can avoid, being a selfish mother. To give you a little bit of background of what happens to Herod and Herodias and Salome. So Herod and Herodias, they end up losing their kingdom. Now, I want to say that there's probably a way that they were running their kingdom they were bad seeds, right, that were being sown, but they lost their kingdom and were exiled, actually. Salome was on her way to go visit her mother, where they were exiled, and ended up falling into an icy river and perishing on that trip to go see her mom where they were exiled. I would venture to say that this is not a happy ending for this family whatsoever. And I would also venture to say that the unrighteous seeds that they had sown, A, starting with the adulterous affair, and B, all the other unrighteousness and sinful living that they had been up to while they were running this kingdom, led to their unfortunate demise of being exiled, and then Salome having to go follow them and dying and perishing on her way. What I always wonder when I read this story is sometimes I would just want to think, like, what would Herodias' life been like had she decided to, instead of having such a vitriol type of response to John the Baptist for criticizing her adulterous affair, and had she turned from her wicked ways and actually followed what John was recommending, which was, to Herod, stop this affair, stop this adulterous marriage, what would her life have turned out like if she stayed with Philip? Furthermore, what would have Salome's life turned out like had she had a mother who knew how to live righteously, who wasn't dealing with so much selfish ambition, who was not determined to follow her fleshly desires instead of living righteously. So those are things that I want to pose to you. Like, what do you think? Put in the comments if you would. What do you think? What do you think her life would have looked like had she had a different mom? Let's go now into Proverbs 31 because this is the woman that we do want to emulate. Proverbs 31, we know, talks about a wife of noble character. So let's kind of now go through a little bit of the traits that had Herodias had. Okay. Salome's life, I guarantee it would have turned out differently. Nobility. Had Herodias had this trait of nobility, instead of seeking power through sinfulness, through flesh and lust, she could have sought God's wisdom and listened to John the Baptist, right? And maybe had some things happen differently in her marriage, right, with Philip, and also in her role as a mom to Salome. Maybe she would not have had Salome out there dancing in front of all these men. How about generosity? Had Herodias been more generous, maybe instead of taking a life, she could have given love and shown righteousness instead of letting pride take root in her heart and being so angry about the holy recommendation that John the Baptist had given to her and her husband about their marriage. Servant hearted. Had she been one to want to serve instead of be served, she only served herself. She would have given Salome an actual, recommendation of whatever it is that she wanted, something that was, more noble in mind, more acceptable, instead of going and having someone killed. Okay, so the Proverbs 31 woman, there's a lot of verses that talks about her diligence. She was a diligent worker. She put her hands to the plow, right? And she made these phenomenal cloths and scarves, and she went out and sold them. She did things for her family. We don't see this. We don't see the diligence of a worker here, because she was she seemed like she was someone who was so focused on being served rather than serve herself. Okay, so how about the traits of being wise and faithful? Being a wise and faithful wife, a wise and faithful mother. Instead, she was cunning and deceitful. Then there are the verses that talks about her children called her blessed, that her children and husband both praised her. These are things that we don't really read about. We don't know whether they did that or not, but we can tell that because, again, going back to the background of the story, they lost their kingdom. They lost their kingdom. So instead of this woman bringing her husband the respect and the honor of those who are in a town that we read about in Proverbs 31, it says that they called her husband blessed. They honored her husband because of because of her character. This is not something that ended up happening with Herod and Herodias. Herodias was actually one who brought her husband demise, so to speak. There are a list of all those traits there that we do want to emulate. Okay. These all come from the Proverbs 31 woman. And then here's a list of all of the traits that we don't want to emulate. Okay. We want to stay away from as much as possible. And to close today, I want to go to Titus, because we are actually instructed as older women, right? And I'm going to say this means that you're older than the women that you're bringing up, that you're raising, that you're training. Doesn't mean that you have to be like 70 and above or something like that to be called an older woman. You just need to be older than the women that you are mentoring and training and leading and guiding. Okay. So Titus 2, and if we start in verse 3 and go through verse 5, it says, likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way that they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. Verse 4, then they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children. Verse 5, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of God. It all comes back to how are we glorifying God, even in how we're mothering and raising our children. Herodias' story and her example may seem a little excessive, right? May seem a little extreme. But what I want you to understand is that your role as a mother and your behavior as a mother can have a positive effect on your children or a negative effect on your children. So this is why I want to encourage you and help remind you that you are helping to shape the next generation. You're helping to cultivate the young disciples in your home. It's such an incredible privilege to be called a mother. And looking at Proverbs 31, I love just taking time to remind myself of these traits that this noble wife of noble character was described as so much. I don't want you to feel like you have to be this perfect mom who never messes up. That's not what I'm saying. There's your disclaimer. What I want to encourage you is to always be thinking about, how am I giving God glory? How is my life in my role as motherhood? How is it honoring God? Okay. And how is it helping my children to be better prepared to go out into the world and be disciples themselves? So that's what I had for you today. I hope and pray that you were encouraged and that you found this helpful. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and make sure you join us on the next episode of the Mama Disciple podcast. Remember that holy stewardship is about managing well what God has given us so that He can bless others through your obedience. Bye for now.